Hello, this is Professor David Bishai, and I'm here to speak about pharmaceuticals and why they are of so much interest to health economists. The outline today is to first talk about what is special and different about the pharmaceutical industry that makes it unlike most other industries in a typical economics class. We'll talk about how their sales have grown over recent years and try to account for the sales growth. What's most interesting about pharmaceutical economics is the pricing. There are distorted incentives in what products get developed, and there are distorted incentives in the pricing because of the potential for pharmaceutical companies to gain monopoly due to patent protection. Finally, we'll talk about global strategies in helping low-income consumers get access to pharmaceutical products, and we'll talk about the impact of policies on the profitability of pharmaceutical companies. The general features that are different about pharmaceutical companies are their high profitability. They generally are earning around 10% profits on average over the 10 to 20 year horizon. They have products that sell at much higher retail prices than the actual cost of goods. So if one looks at what the incoming chemicals cost to acquire, as well as the cost of labor, the prices charged for a typical pharmaceutical product are heavily marked up. Pharmaceutical companies quickly justify this by pointing to their high research and development costs as well as their high marketing costs. And we will be examining some of these claims. But we know that in the health economy, consumers have health insurance that helps to pay for their pharmaceutical purchases. And we'll talk about the ways that private insurance pays for pharmaceuticals as well as Medicare Part D, and look for ways these policies might actually be contributing to the rising prices of pharmaceuticals. We'll talk about their spending on research and development, look through the structure of the development of a particular drug product, and examine the claims that pharmaceutical development is a high-risk endeavor. So let's look at a comparison of the pharmaceutical industry to the music industry. Both industries have to produce products that cost them a lot of money to develop. In the pharmaceutical industry, the R&D goes to develop the patents and the chemical structures and to prove that these products are safe. And then that R&D has to be paid for in a market that is not very friendly to making those payments. The markup is much, much higher than the marginal cost. In the music industry, they also have incredibly high costs in producing their intellectual property. And consumers know that to get one more song listen is pennies, or in fact often free. So how does the music industry recover its R&D costs? It's a challenge, and artists are frequently going on tour and marking up their products much, much higher in live concerts compared to the cost of a download. However, consumers in the music industry really understand that they are buying intellectual property, and they don't look at the value proposition in terms of what it actually costs to make those airwaves vibrate. They are understanding that they are actually buying the intellectual property of the artist. However, in the pharmaceutical industry, consumers see this physical item, a pill or a syringe, and they think that they are buying the pills, and it makes them confused when the pharmaceutical company marks up the chemical by a very high markup in order to pay for its intellectual property. Both industries try to protect themselves in their development of intellectual property with protections. The copyrights for a sound recording last for 50 years. Patents for a new drug last for 20 years. So both industries have some government-related protections for their development of intellectual property. Well, the pharmaceutical industry is doing quite well. I'm not so sure about the music industry. The pharmaceutical industry is seeing a lot of growth in its presence in the health economy. It's now accounting for more than 10% of health expenditure. And most of the growth of pharmaceuticals is because people are using more of them. So if you can see in the table from the Burnt reading, the sales growth of pharmaceuticals has been quite steady in the double digits. And that means more and more units of pharmaceuticals are being used by consumers. Their prices are also growing by single digits, and this is also a trend that has continued over the last 10 to 20 years. How do we explain why American consumers are using more and more drugs? Well, there are three reasons. One is the development of better and more efficient insurance coverage for pharmaceuticals over the last 2 to 3 decades. Consumers have found their insurance plans simply being better able to cover the costs of paying for pharmaceuticals. Second is that there's been innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. The products are better. The drugs treat more diseases than they ever could before. And because of this, physicians and hospitals are substituting chemicals instead of surgeries and inpatient stays. The best example is HIV, where prior to the development of these very, very effective HIV and AIDS drugs, patients used to spend many weeks or months in the hospital dying of AIDS. Similar, hepatitis C is undergoing its own revolution, where other hepatitis C used to create extensive costs for the treatment of cirrhosis and end-stage liver disease, but now patients are turning to outpatient medications and saving the health system from spending on hospitalization. So one example of better insurance coverage is Medicare Part D. If you've looked at the lecture on Medicare Part D, you know that this is a relatively recent, it is the most recent development in Medicare. It started in January of 2006. Consumers pay a deductible for their healthcare costs, so they're going to pay the first $325. In its initial design, Medicare Part D was designed to have a donut hole where the consumer would get pretty decent coverage with only a 25% copay up until around $3,000, but then they would face a donut hole in the middle as they went from $3,000 to about $5,000. After they've spent $5,000 in a given year, then they got pretty good coverage with a 0% copay. This donut hole was closed under the ACA, and because of this improvement in coverage, we can predict that drug prices will be rising for the rest of this decade. Outside of Medicare, insurance coverage for drugs has increased. This is due to the invention of three-tier insurance in private pharmaceuticals. In three-tier insurance, one faces very, very good coverage for generics, followed by a second tier where one can access a preferred brand name with a 21% or somewhat less good coverage. And finally, if a consumer selects a non-preferred brand name, they get the least coverage. With three-tiered insurance, the pharmaceutical companies find that consumers get better copays in general. The insurance companies do this because if they were able to move their consumers into a preferred name brand, they acquire monopsony buying power, and they can go to the drug company and say, if we move all of our ulcer patients to purchase Protonix instead of Nexium, can you give us a bargain? And the pharmaceutical company would say, well, look at all those millions of consumers, sure, we'll give you a bargain. So they can negotiate preferred rates to be included on the formulary of a large and powerful insurance company. As said earlier, the development of new drugs accounts for some of the spending growth, and about 42% of spending growth has been on new drugs. A lot of those new drugs are called Me Too drugs, where rather than actually developing a new category of treatment, one simply creates a molecular change to an existing product. For example, an antibiotic that many of you may have heard of called levofloxacin is simply a purified form of ciprofloxacin. For those of you who know a little bit of chemistry, levofloxacin is just a purified isomer of cipro, which is a mixture of both the dextro and the levo isomers. Another example in AIDS treatment is the drug called lopinavir. Lopinavir was developed by Abbott Labs, who simply added a carbon molecule to an existing protease inhibitor called ritonavir and developed a brand new drug. Now, with good marketing, if you get an FDA approval, you can develop some market share simply with a Me Too drug. In addition to Me Too drugs, there have been a lot of new categories of drugs over the last several decades. Just examples in HIV/AIDS. There's been revolutions in how we treat AIDS patients. There's been new categories of ulcer drugs, new categories of depression drugs, diabetes drugs, and so on, that has led to increased sales growth in the pharmaceutical industry. Part of what we want to think about in our reading is a market failure in the match between the drugs that get developed and the needs of the world. And I just want to raise the issue of malaria. Malaria is one of the biggest infectious disease killers in the world, and there have been no new malaria drugs for over a decade. It doesn't take a lot to figure out why. Most people who get malaria are relatively poor, and pharmaceutical companies don't want to spend their precious research and development funds on diseases for poor people. It's just more profit friendly to research chronic diseases of rich people. In general, acute diseases or tropical diseases don't get used long enough. An infection's only going to last a few weeks, and so if you sell somebody an antibiotic, they're only going to use it for 10 days. If you sell somebody a vaccine, they're only going to use it for one time every 10 years. That's really not a smart way to make a lot of money. If you develop a new insulin for a diabetic or a new drug for somebody with high blood pressure, they'll use that every day for the rest of their life, and you're going to make a whole lot more money. So pharmaceutical companies would rather spend their research funds on high profit making drugs for the chronic diseases of rich people. One of the reasons mentioned earlier on why pharmaceutical sales have increased is the substitution between hospitalization and expensive surgeries to drug treatment. HIV is the classic case of this, where patients just don't end up sick in the hospital with end-stage AIDS as much as before. They can be kept out of the hospital and have vastly improved outcomes with the current set of AIDS drugs. And in mental health, psychiatric counseling and cognitive therapy is very labor-intensive, and it would be much more efficient to use pills to help patients with their schizophrenia and depression. And there's been a substitution to this effect with the development of new drugs for depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. Let's talk a little bit about the development of these products. The triangle on the slide is here to suggest the basic way that drug companies screen many possible molecules for bioactivity. When they find promising molecules in the middle of the triangle, they'll start to do human trials, and we'll talk about the phases in just a minute. But at the end, very few drugs finally get FDA approval. And so the basic idea is that the large expenses on intake and screening these thousands of molecules, most of which have really no usefulness, makes the drug companies spend money on things that don't work. And in the end, after spending a lot of attention on dead ends, they'll finally get a hit at the end of a long process. So the drug companies say that it's costing nearly $1 billion, and it might take as much as a decade or more to take a molecule from just being one of many thousands of molecules all the way to a market-approved, FDA-approved drug in the market. They say that these costs are going up. The real cost is going up over the last 2 to 3 decades, going up for a variety of reasons, some of which is related to their liability exposure, as well as to the basic inflation of the costs of doing randomized trials, which are necessary. Drug companies burn up some of their patent time doing the trials, and the FDA trials come in 3 phases. In phase 1, after a candidate molecule looks promising, a phase 1 trial might have very few volunteers, maybe about 10 volunteers. 2 see if the drug is safe to give to humans. These are very high-risk trials. The drug companies don't want to use that many volunteers. Obviously, we'll want to do some animal studies before human trials, but the FDA does require some human trials to ask whether the drug has unanticipated side effects. After phase 1 trial says that it is safe to give to humans, it can go on to phase 2, where the doses are worked out, and pharmaceutical companies look for the right dosing to get the effect of therapy that they're looking for. Finally, in phase 3, the large trial is done, and you need large sample sizes statistically to prove that the drug is effective against a disease. And if there is already a product on the market for that disease, you can't simply leave those patients with a placebo. You have to give them an effective treatment for ethical reasons. And so a typical phase 3 trial is called a non-inferiority trial to prove that the candidate drug is effective and not worse than existing therapies. So as this procedure runs out, at the end they might have invested about $1 billion, and then they can produce these pills very, very cheaply, but they're obviously not going to sell their drug for the marginal cost of production. They're going to want to recover their R&D costs. Isoniazid, for instance, is a byproduct of many chemical processes, and companies can actually produce it very, very cheaply per pill. So given that a drug company has acquired a FDA-approved drug and is probably burnt out about 5 or 6 years out of its patent, it has a limited time to get its R&D investments recovered. I want to go over a case study just to show what might happen as this goes forward and how a drug company would use its monopoly power to set a profit-maximizing price. I want to give the example of ritonavir. So ritonavir was one of the very first protease inhibitors used to treat HIV/AIDS. When it was first released and went through its FDA trials, they found that the effective dose was 400 milligrams twice a day, and the Abbott labs said that to recover its R&D costs, they would price it at about $10 per pill, which would be about 60 pills per patient per month, and they would recover $600 per month from every HIV patient in the US at this time. So they release their drug, they start pricing it $10 per pill. It's effective and gets good market share, but after about 1 or 2 years, there was some technical developments. First off, even though it was effective for AIDS, it had side effects at that 400 milligram dosage. And so AIDS doctors started to lower the dose, and they found something remarkable. They found that at 100 milligrams twice a day, ritonavir would boost the efficacy of other drugs. And so AIDS doctors immediately began to have their patients cut their pills into quarters and start giving 100 milligrams plus another drug, a substitute drug that had come out. And now Abbott Labs still has market share, but all of their AIDS patients are only using a quarter as much of their product as before. So Abbott Labs does the obvious thing from an economic perspective. They had calculated that they needed $600 per month per AIDS patients to make up their R&D. So they raised the price per pill to $40 per pill. And they tried to explain to the AIDS doctors of America that, look, we just did this R&D and we need to recover R&D, and that just didn't fly. The doctors began to lead boycotts. The Abbott Labs exhibit was torched at one of the AIDS meetings, and there was a movement on to boycott Abbott Labs because they were price gouging and trying to suck money out of dying AIDS patients by trying to recover their R&D. Even though they realized that they had to charge a profit-maximizing price, and they had very effective drug that had no good substitutes, even when it was boosted, the drug company made some missteps in how it trying to create an understanding of their profit-maximizing strategy. The ritonavir case shows a conflict between society's two interests. The basic plan of patent protection to incentivize research and development creates a conflict between people who are sick and dying today, giving money into the system. The money that the sick and dying pay for drugs is used to finance the research and discovery of cures for people 10 to 20 to 30 years into the future. And the pricing models of monopoly pricing charges high prices and restricts access to products that could be used to heal people today. And because of those high prices, the system is saying, well, we will let some people die today who can't afford these high prices, but guess what? 10 to 20 years from now, we'll develop new cures, and people in the future will have cures that wouldn't happen unless these people died today because they couldn't afford our drugs. In general, it's old people who are getting sick and who might be complaining about lack of access to pharmaceuticals. They're only going to be around for a few more decades, and they're not very happy about their money being used to fund drug discoveries for people who are now college students or middle-aged people. And so this basic tension between saving lives today versus having the ability to save lives in the future is something that won't go away as long as we use these patent system. But patents are only one method for R&D. They do reward innovation by giving the innovator monopoly pricing power, and it's up to the patent holder to use the power. It's not like Congress is saying you have to gouge AIDS patients. Abbott Labs decided to do that. There are other options that economists think about in order to incentivize R&D. One is to have a contest where you get a reward for developing new R&D. A second option is a guaranteed purchase agreement where if you produce a product that meets several specifications, governments will promise that you will have a market and that you will make sales at a specified price. For example, the countries of Northern Europe decided to sponsor a guaranteed purchase agreement for the development of a new vaccine for pneumococcal pneumonia for children in Asia. There was a specification that the new pneumococcal vaccine would cover multiple antigens and be sold for a price of about $4. And drug companies competed to deliver such a product that met the specifications. The governments of Europe that sponsored the agreement didn't have to actually pay the drug companies. They simply needed to make sure that the countries of Asia would actually purchase hundreds of millions of doses, and that actually happened. So simply saying there will be a market if you produce this thing incentivized the development of a product that met those price points. So that was an innovative strategy that allowed a product to come in and hit a price of about $4. Now, a $4 vaccine in India is a crazy high price. You can cover a child in India against polio and diphtheria and pertussis and tetanus and tuberculosis and buy vaccines that are all less than about $1. And so to have one new vaccine for $4 is a real shock to the system. And we have to be a little bit interested in finding ways to get prices even lower. So I want to talk about this other alternative called tiered pricing. With monopoly pricing, the pharmaceutical company sets one price, and it offers windfall profits. But I want you to think about something that might be even more useful in this setting, which is tiered pricing. It is basically price discrimination, and one can sell products at tiered prices as long as your customers can't resell the product to each other, and as long as your customers have a variety of different willingness to pay. If all of the customers only want to buy it at one price, you can't charge them different prices. But if you are able to break your market up into people who pay a lot, people who pay less than a lot, people who pay just a little bit, you can actually make even more money than monopoly. But the critical part is having policymakers keep your customers from reselling drugs to each other. Now, in pharmaceuticals, as they set prices, they tend to set different prices for different countries. Across the globe, Americans always pay the highest drug prices on the planet, partly because we have this weird insurance system that really doesn't have a lot of monopoly buying power. Other countries in Europe buy products as a block. The UK has single-payer insurance, and the entire country of the UK has negotiated drug prices as a block. Same for Germany and France and Japan, and they're paying the second highest drug prices as they negotiate with their drug companies. In Southern Europe, in Greece and Croatia and Serbia, they have somewhat weaker economies, and they say, look, we're poor here in Croatia, we cannot pay German prices, and drug companies cut them a break. Lower prices than Croatia and Serbia come from the middle-income countries of Asia and Latin America. So Brazil, Thailand, Vietnam are paying a lower middle tier. And finally, the bottom tier is Africa, India, Pakistan, where the prices are rock bottom. Drug companies here generally are pricing just above their marginal production cost and not really seeking to recovering their research and development costs. So I want to show you just a quick picture of something you probably have seen before. This is what price discrimination looks at. We see here a monopolist would be charging monopoly price P sub M at point A, and all of the customers of the world would be charged price P sub M. And that really doesn't offer the drug company the opportunity to charge a price slightly below PM, this one price right about here, and then charge another country that price and another country that price, and so on and so forth, and finally charge the countries of Africa that price, which is at the marginal cost. If one is able to segment the market, you take home this entire blue triangle in addition to this windfall profit rectangle that we know the monopolist was going to get. So drug companies are really excited about trying to grab hold of this extra triangle of windfall profits, and they really appreciate chances to do this type of tiered pricing. So if we look at what happens here, this would be the consumer surplus that the drug company can capture if it can have multiple tiered pricing levels. Well, what goes wrong with this can be arbitrage opportunities, and if you've ever been on vacation in a country like Mexico or Latin America, it's not uncommon for you to go shopping for lower priced drugs. You come home with Tylenol or aspirin or even antibiotics that cost a small fraction of what they would cost in the US. Even today, you can see elderly people up in Minnesota and Vermont making bus rides into Canada and committing arbitrage and going in and buying cheaper drugs in Canadian pharmacy companies in order to save money. This can't be done by retailers. The U.S. Congress says it's illegal for Rite Aid to go get on a bus and go shopping for drugs in Canada and bring them back and sell them in Rite Aid. If you are selling retail pharmaceuticals in the U.S., they have to be coming through the general distribution channel and paying whatever price the drug company is charging American distributors. And the FDA says this is out of a concern for safety. It has only put its FDA approval on drugs sold by the pharmaceutical company into its distribution channel. So tiered pricing is part of the landscape in pharmaceuticals, and it's done in order to offer revenue, but it does require countries to be playing ball with the pharmaceutical companies in order to guarantee these low resale points. Now, last few points I wanted to make about pharmaceuticals is about their profits. As I said when we started the lecture, pharmaceutical companies really do look highly profitable. Many people see that profitability as perhaps a problem and one that reflects a need to do more regulation. One of the issues that comes up is an accounting issue. The problem with using the typical ratio of profits to sales makes it look like drug companies are highly profitable. However, if the accountant takes the R&D outlays from all the last 10 years and puts it onto the balance sheet, then the internal rate of return of investing in pharmaceutical companies is much more like the regular other elements of the industry. So for instance, if we do this type of accounting procedure, the mean return for 118 drugs would suggest an internal rate of return of just about 11.5%. And drug companies say, yeah, they are 3 points higher than in general, and that's because they take higher risk. They have to spend money on R&D, and it doesn't always pay off. And if their industry takes higher risk, then it deserves to be rewarded by higher profits. Okay, so let's summarize. What we saw is that pharmaceuticals are a growing expenditure in the U.S. healthcare system. We accounted for that with 3 explanations. One is that the insurance coverage has increased. Second is that there are better products. And third, doctors and hospitals are substituting drugs for costly hospitalizations. We made the point that the pricing is widely misunderstood. Because of the intellectual property features of drugs, they should be thought of much more like music or something creative. And the drug companies are selling that intellectual property. They are not selling the molecular chemical packed into a pill. This is not widely understood, and this misunderstanding leads to a lot of pushback against the markups that are seen in the pharmaceutical industry. We spent the last part of lecture looking at the incentives for research and development. We notice, and we are very concerned, that drug companies do not innovate towards the diseases that are affecting the poor, and they distort their investment against high-profit diseases. Furthermore, we see conflict and tension as people who are sick today are being asked to pay and to suffer obstacles to getting access to drugs in order to generate money that will help develop new cures for generations in the future. Current scholarship in health economics is looking for alternative ways to motivate research and development that is more efficient and less beset by conflict between generations. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to more discussions of the pharmaceutical industry and its economics.